friends of more active all you fellow delegates. For those who don't know me, I'm Andy Mushet, and I'm the Managing Director of Supersonic Events. We at the Supersonic Events run the international conference on the history of Freemasonry. We are indeed the promoters of the event. And on behalf of my fellow directors and indeed everyone who is associated with ICHF, I would like to welcome you to the 4th International Conference on the History of Freemasonry. Today we are very privileged indeed to have, and honoured indeed, to have the presence of our very special patron, Lord Elgin, who has been so supportive of the ICHF, the Scottish initiative, since its inception some 8 years ago. We are so thankful and grateful to Lord Elgin for his support. We are We're also very privileged today, ladies and gentlemen, to have another of our wonderful patrons here, and that's the Grand Master Mason, Charles E. Robert Coleridge Gordon of Essendon, who, like his predecessor before him, is giving unstinting help and assistance in helping to establish the ICHF as the premier conference of its kind. And our heartfelt gratitude goes to you, Grand Master, for all the help that you've given, and indeed the Grand Lords of Scotland in making this event happen. Thank you, Grand Master. Indeed, I received a text message only last night from our other patrons, Sir Archie Ewing and Marcus Humphrey Dinnet, who of course couldn't be here. They're on Masonic duty elsewhere, but they also send their greetings to you and hope that you enjoy the conference, and it was signed Cock in the North. So Marcus Humphrey Dinnet signs himself as well. It also gives me the great pleasure to welcome the Lord Lieutenant and Lord Provost of the City of Edinburgh, the Right Honourable Don Wilson, who will taking time out of his very busy schedule to come along here today. And I would now ask the Lord Provost to address the Assembly.
Grand Master, delegates. I thought I would start off by just saying what Lord Lieutenant and Lord Provost meant, since there were in fact, I think, represented some 26 countries and 5 continents here this morning. So very quickly, the Lord Provost is, like the Mayor, ceremonial and civic leader of the city, and it comes with a number of other titles, including Lord Lieutenant and First Citizen. That's First Citizen not in the American meaning, but as an official historic title where you represent the people of the city. In this case, of course, Scotland's great capital city. I would emphasise that simply because you might wonder why I was so determined to be at this particular conference. And the reason that I was so keen to be here is because the history of this capital city is linked with Freemasonry in a way where you could never delineate the two. The links are right through history and very, very close and multifaceted. For a start, Edinburgh has a wonderful architectural heritage, and all of that, of course, is down to Masonry and Freemasonry. And indeed, this wonderful hall that we're in, which is just over 100 years old, is a fine example. Other fine examples are all over the city. Indeed, most of Edinburgh's historic new town was built by John Adam, a Freemason, and also, of course, the city chambers, my offices, are another fine example. We're very proud of our architecture, and I'm particularly proud of the city chambers and my offices. And if during your time you happen to be up there and passing, if you want to pop in, I'd be more than proud to show you around. The history, however, is not just confined to architecture. It permeates every aspect of the historical life of the city. And I am particularly proud and want to encourage and develop the history and the customs of Edinburgh, of Scotland's capital city. I think it makes us who we are, and it gives us our sense of belonging and gives us a sense of presence. So I think, given that I come from a computing background, people might have been a little bit worried last year when I became Lord Provost that I was going to modernise everything and I was going to sweep away some of the traditions. Quite the reverse is true, and that is the reason I think why I'm here today. I was at the #1 Burns Club, Burns Supper, quite quickly after becoming Lord Provost, and I was doing my research and made a speech of that. And it's just an example of the way that the history of Freemasonry is allied to the history of the city. That quite a large part of my speech was, of course, concerned with our national bard, Robbie Burns, and who was first proclaimed the national bard at the St Andrew's Lodge. And I read out quite a lengthy quote, which I'll not read out today because of time permitting. But it was during his stay in Edinburgh that Burns was described as Caledonian's bard, which led to his place in our literary history as Scotland's national poet. Following a visit to Lodge St Andrew on the 12th of January 1787, Burns wrote to a friend, "I went to a Mason lodge yesternight. The Grand Master presided with great solemnity and honour. Among other general toasts, gave Caledonia and Caledonia's bard, Brother Burns, which rang through the whole assembly with multiplied honours and repeated acclamations. I had no idea such a thing would happen, and was downright thunderstruck, and trembling in every nerve, made the best return in my power." Now obviously, Robert Burns is quite central to Scotland's history, and indeed internationally famous. We live in a city which has architecture which is iconic and also internationally famous. I am more than delighted to be part of this conference, and I was absolutely determined I was going to come here as Edinburgh's first citizen. And on behalf of the people of Edinburgh, wish you a good conference. I hope you find it interesting, and I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you will return in the future to Edinburgh. Thank you.
Thank you indeed, Lord Provost, for those words of welcome to the city. And now, ladies and gentlemen, I would ask the Grand Master Mason to officially open the conference. Grand Master.
Brother Lord Elgin, Right Honourable Donald Wilson, Lord Lieutenant and Lord Provost of the City of Edinburgh, ladies, gentlemen and brethren. The Lord Provost has already welcomed you to Scotland and Edinburgh, and I would now like to welcome you to the Grand Lodge of Scotland and to this 4th International Conference on the History of Freemasonry. I am very pleased to especially welcome the Senior Past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, the Right Honourable the Earl of Elgin and Kincardine, who, as I recall, at the last conference we hosted, corrected one of our esteemed speakers by returning to the family home at Broom Hall and retrieving from his extensive archives of personal papers an original document which supported Lord Elgin's position. It is a testament to the universality of the institution of Freemasonry that we have today delegates from all over the world. And over the next 3 days, we are going to be listening to speakers from many countries presenting papers on diverse topics. The study of Freemasonry and its historical origins is, I believe now, recognised as a bona fide subject for scholarly and academic research, and this is underlined by the number of distinguished academics we have here today. We are going to hear how Freemasonry has developed over the years in various countries and how Freemasonry has influenced the inextricable link to many fields of human endeavour and philosophical thought. As head of the Scottish craft, I am very conscious of our history and traditions. Grand lodges and individual lodges guard their traditions jealously, and it is one of the cornerstones and strengths of our craft that these traditions be maintained. The Grand Lodge of Scotland has today lodges in 45 countries, and whenever I am visiting our lodges, I am struck by the fierce loyalty that our brethren overseas show to the traditions and customs of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. The vast majority of our brethren overseas are not misguided expats longing for a Scottish Masonic utopia, which probably never existed anyway, but are born and bred citizens of their own countries. Disparate nationalities, races and religions who have never set foot in Scotland, but are bound together by the common bond of being Scottish Freemasons. However, as important that history and tradition is, we must not use them as an excuse for remaining in the past or refusing to acknowledge that we are living in a time of rapid change, both in the craft and society. Communications have changed out of all recognition in the last decade. We cannot ignore these changes, and hearkening back to the good old days is a futile exercise. If we are to survive and grow stronger, we have to embrace these changes and show the world that Freemasonry is still relevant in the 21st century. Conferences such as this gives delegates the opportunity to listen to and discuss ideas and concepts about the origin of Freemasonry, some of which may be quite unfamiliar to you, or with which you may disagree, but can only increase our understanding of Freemasonry and help those of us who are practicing Freemasons to promote the craft. Such conferences as this don't, of course, just happen. There is a tremendous amount of organisation and planning to be done, and at times great efforts in diplomacy and tact are required. I would like to thank the local organising committee, the academic committee, the supersonic events, and especially Andrew Mushat, Ewan Rutherford and Robert Cooper for the huge amount of time and resources they have devoted to this task over the last few months. Apart from the formal proceedings, I do hope that you will be able to enjoy yourselves in a more relaxed atmosphere at the drinks reception here this evening and the gala dinner on Saturday. To old friends, welcome back, and to new ones, I hope your visit to this wonderful historic city will remain long in your memory. As a nation of rather average footballing ability once claimed, rather extravagantly, that football is coming home, having won the event for an international tournament, I think I can say with rather more confidence and accuracy that Freemasonry is coming home. I wish all the delegates giving papers the best of luck, and I hope you have an enjoyable and enlightening experience. Accordingly, I now declare the 4th International Conference on the History of Freemasonry open.
gentlemen, I'd like to reiterate what the Grand Master had mentioned there. But prior to handing it over to the academic committee, there's something I'd like to say. I'll read this to you and I'll leave it with you. We are living in a most wonderful age. The whole world is in a state of active interest. Ambitions are rife in every land. Storms are brewing in every sky, and scurrying clouds portend a tempest. In state and church, in society, in every department of life, there is fermentation. There is suspicion and distrust everywhere that looks with jealous eye upon the motives of men. Labour and capital are at daggers' points, churches are divided upon creeds, and heated discussions and coarse vituperations threaten to overthrow great doctrines and the excommunication of great divines. The storm waxes hence, and the winds are at variance. While this state of affair exists in the world, there is peace and harmony in the fraternity of Freemasons. In a few jurisdictions, differences have existed, but the wiser counsels are prevailing, and the clouds are lifted, and behold, the bright sun of peace shines brightly. Never before in the history of the world has Freemasonry occupied the proud position it holds today. What has brought about this happy coincidence? One of the great promoters of the peace, harmony, prosperity and usefulness of the fraternity is the absence of any sectarian doctrine. Masonry is for man of whatever creed or belief. God is the one Father to whom we must yield obedience. We must square our conscience with His divine rule and pay our homage to His divine law according to the inner consciousness. We stand alone before God. Therefore, there can be no unseemly disputing that brings out the hatred that dwells in the human heart. The most bitter warfare is that of religious sects, and the world looks on with smiling compliance while the doctors destroy each other. We should be thankful that within the fraternity no such scenes exist. Ambition seems to have been lost in the great overshadowing spirit of charity, which unites us into a society of earnest, active, living men, ready to do what the necessities of the hour requires. While we mourn over the bitterness that is everywhere to be found, let us rejoice that no schisms can enter our fraternity as long as we cling to the pure doctrines we teach. The great fundamental principle of our society is love. And omnia vincit amor, love conquers all things. Masonry was born, it exists, it has work to perform. The question or not is whether that work is being done. That could have been written yesterday. It is in fact an extract, a printed extract from a publication called the Masonic Record, which was produced in Glasgow in 1891. And in fact it was called A Dispatch from New York. So it's important, ladies and gentlemen, that these conferences, as the Grand Master Mason said and Lord Provost has alluded to as well, these conferences are here to bring disparate strands together. Freemasons, academia, and members of the public. And now I've been reliably informed that Lord Elgin would like to address you and say a few words. Thank you.
Lord Provost, ladies, gentlemen, and all of you who've taken the enormous trouble to be here alone. Lord Provost has talked to you about his city, and indeed it's a wonderful city. But there are little stories that I think a Freemason would enjoy. Those of you who come from the civilised parts of Scotland to the north come into Edinburgh over the Dean Bridge. The Dean Bridge was built by order of the then Lord Provost by Thomas Telford, a great engineer of the 18th and 19th century. Unfortunately, although born in Scotland and a great Scot, he had to go to England to find work, and then he became a Freemason in England. But never mind, these things do happen. But when he came to get the authority to build the bridge over the water of Leith to bring people into Edinburgh from Hythe, he designed one of the most beautiful structures ever to be built with stone and lime. And he gave the work to a great Scots mason, John Gibb. And Gibb's family for several generations had not only been stonemasons, but they had also been Freemasons, speculative Freemasons. And in order to ensure the work was properly done, Gibb built a sort of cabin so that he could see the men at work. And he had a loud hailer, and if one was not working properly, he would shout at him to work better. And if that didn't have the trick, he'd go down himself and cuff a bit of sense into his lugs and tell him to get a move on, and then give him a little dose of snuff to make his peace. And you know what happened? The bridge was built 6 months early. And the Lord Provost was delighted. And he came, "Well done, Mr. Gibb," he said. "Think of all the tolls we're going to get over the next 6 months." And Gibb looked at him. "I'm not so sure about that, Lord Provost," he said, "but according to the contract, I'm only to hand the bridge over to you 6 months from now, so I'm going to keep the tolls in the meantime." Lord Provost, your city is full of these stories of active masonry, and I thank you for the welcome that you've given to us all. It's a wonderful thing to be even an occasional patron of this great gathering, but I wish you all have enormous happiness in the days that you're with us, and thank you so much for your attendance.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Lord. They're very, very special patrons and great supporters of the ICHF. Now, no time running on, ladies and gentlemen. Without further ado, I should like to hand over the conference now to our Head of the Academic Committee, Andrew Prescott, who will begin today's proceedings. Andrew.
Thank you very much. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Prescott. I'm from King's College in London, and it's been a privilege for me this year to help work with the Academic Committee to assemble the programme that we hope that you'll be enjoying over the next few days. The first speaker, who is my duty to introduce, is a great pleasure for me to introduce, is Jim Daniel. The reason it's a particular pleasure for me to introduce Jim is because I supervised Jim's doctoral thesis while I was at the University of Sheffield, and it's always a great moment of pleasure for a supervisor to see a student give a high-profile lecture. One of the duties of an academic supervisor when the business of completing the PhD thesis is over is supposed to be to continue to enhance and develop the academic career of their student. But in the case of Jim, that's rather difficult for me because I think one could say he already had a far more distinguished career than his supervisor. So it was rather difficult for me to take it forward any further. As you'll see from the programme, Jim had a very distinguished career as a diplomat, working with the British Council and serving as cultural attaché in Washington, DC. And indeed, I went to a conference last month where there was a very splendid reception in a splendid house, which to my amazement turned out to be only the Deputy Ambassador's house. It was rather superb at Washington. And I was not surprised to find that the name of Jim Daniel resonated amongst our diplomatic representatives in Washington, DC, with very good memories and very good contacts. So Jim was enormously successful as a diplomat, and then went on to devote his administrative and diplomatic skills to the administration of Freemasonry, first as Secretary General to the Supreme Council, and then subsequently as a very successful Grand Secretary to the United Grand Lodge of England. And it was on retirement that Jim decided that he would like to build on his already considerable stature as a contributor on 19th century history, so especially Masonic periodicals. He'd like to build on that and complete a doctoral thesis. And that's actually a very, very hard undertaking, because you've got to build a lot of extra understanding onto material you already know very well. And I admire enormously the enthusiasm and the spirit and the effectiveness with which Jim situated his Masonic understanding within wider historiographical debates. And I think what the fusion that he achieved in his thesis and in subsequent publications is quite remarkable. And I'm sure he's going to demonstrate that for you this morning, so I'm waiting eagerly to hear Jim talk to us on the rise and fall of empire and comparing Britain's and the United Grand Lodge of England's empire. Jim.
If anyone would like to follow the Lord Provost and others out of the hall, this is the moment that they should do so. First, let me say what an honour it is to be invited to present a paper at any plenary session of this international conference on the history of Freemasonry, let alone at the opening session. Mind you, I was particularly happy to see that in spite of all his other activities, looking at the list of participants, David Cameron was with us today. Not the David Cameron. Andrew has already said an awful lot about my past. I will cut that part out and start by saying, now doctored, I still regard myself as an amateur, and I trust you will pay this amateur historian at least as much attention as you do to your long-suffering campanologist. In either role, I will, of course, do my best to avoid dropping any clangers, and as far as this paper is concerned, I'll welcome any comments and criticisms when I finish presenting it, unfortunately for you, in about 50 minutes' time. John Darwin, in his After Tamerlane, The Global History of Empires, wrote that the history of the world is an imperial history, the history of empires. I shall attempt to compare two of these, Britain's and that of the United Grand Lodge of England, which in future I will refer to as the UGLE. I shall hardly touch on their rise, but concentrate on the disintegration of what in 1887 the Prince of Wales called England's Masonic Empire. Contrast this with that of the British Empire, and then consider the relationship between London and its independent progeny today. And I'll start this paper by surveying four periods: 1850 to 1918, 1919 to 1939, 40 to 61, and from 62 to the present day. In each, I'll summarise relevant aspects of the history of the British Empire and its later incarnations, and then look in more detail at the formation of Grand Lodges in territories beyond the British Isles that once belonged to the British Empire, comparing and contrasting with the imperial history as I go. But first I need to make two general points, which, if the clicker is working, should come up now. A Grand Lodge is an independent sovereign body, subject and not subject or owing any allegiance to any other Masonic authority. And by English Freemasonry here, I mean craft or basic Freemasonry, that is the first 3 degrees as worked in lodges under the jurisdiction of the UGLE. I shall refer to Scotland and Ireland, but I obviously haven't had time to take their empires into account as fully. Let me just sketch the overall scene. According to the St James's Gazette in 1901, Queen Victoria ascended the throne of an empire embracing 8.3 million square miles, and she handed it to King Edward in 1901 with 3 million miles added to it. The empire to which Victoria acceded in 1837 covered 1/6 of the land, and that of King Edward nearly 1/4. Since then, most of the territories that comprised the British Empire have become independent nations, the remainder being styled today the overseas territories of the United Kingdom. There you have the list, and at the bottom I add, and of course, Sweet Rock Hall. As for England's Masonic Empire, which in the 1850s spread from Canada to New Zealand and from the Himalayas to the Cape of South Africa, it would seem at first glance to have suffered a similar fate, with the formation since then of Grand Lodges in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Africa, India, and the Mediterranean. So how did this disintegration come about? Let's look at the first period. And these are the sections I will go through in this first period. So 1850 to 1918. The first wake-up call for those who at the end of the 18th century might have thought that the British Empire, as then constituted, was indestructible, came with the Declaration of Independence in 1776 by some of the British king's British subjects in North America. Some politicians thought that Britain could have avoided the loss of those 13 colonies if it had paid greater attention to their pleas for devolution and not offered them too little self-government too late. A view which was to temper the way in which the British government, and indeed the UGLE, handled relations with their progeny, at least in Canada and Australia. During the 19th century, millions of Britons left the British Isles for new lives in Britain's colonies in British North America, today's Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These white settlers had various reasons to emigrate to the colonies of white settlement, but they were all subjects of the British Crown, and their leaders, at least, were aware of their rights as such. The aspirations of these neo-Britons could not long be satisfied by a form of government, the key features of which were colonial governors appointed by the Crown without any consultation with the settlers, the lack of representation in the metropolis, and legislation imposed by the monarch's imperial government with little understanding of or responsiveness to the settlers' special needs and circumstances. These settlers agitated for responsible government as soon as they found their feet. And once the settlers began to prosper, British governments sought ways to encourage them to bear more of the cost of defending and governing the territories they now occupied. And therein lay what Daniel Gorman has described as the perennial paradigm of empire, imperium et libertas, and indeed the problem of maintaining imperial unity while also preserving the cherished ideal of freedom. In Canada, it was above all the 8th Earl of Elgin who shaped the power, the answer to the problem of imperial organisation, and found a solution which proved enduring. As governor of the United Provinces of Upper and Lower Canada from 1849 to 1854, Elgin confirmed responsible government, whereafter the colony was generally left to its own devices in matters of internal administration. Executive authority passed to locally elected politicians, responsible to the electorate on the one hand, and to the Crown on the other, through governors appointed by the monarch on the advice of the government in London. And as this new model of colonial governance appeared to reconcile colonial self-government with imperial unity, it was rapidly introduced in the same decade throughout Britain's other colonies in British North America, Australia, and New Zealand. Then, in 1867, some of the Canadian provinces were confederated and thereafter designated as the Dominion of Canada, the first dominion to be formed in the British Empire. Lord Carnarvon, the then colonial secretary, saw confederation as an enhancement of responsible government. that would enable colonial nationalism within an imperial context, strengthen Canada's links with Britain, and yet allow Britain to reduce the costs and withdraw its imperial garrison from Canada. But as his permanent undersecretary in the Colonial Office had forecast in 1866, responsible government, once established, the dissolution of the empire becomes a matter of time, perhaps a very long time. The 6 self-governing Australian colonies took until 1901 to federate politically as the Commonwealth of Australia, and thereby to accept dominion status and the added responsibilities for self-government this entailed. Uniform culture and settlement experience failed to arrest the fragmentation of the continent into 6 distinct colonies, probably because, unlike their Canadian counterparts, they didn't have an independent and potentially threatening republic on their doors, whose constituent parts had fought for and gained the future nation's independence from Britain. Indeed, each colony was more tightly integrated into British commerce than with each other. And New Zealand didn't achieve dominion status until 1907. And at this point, I should stress that the white settlers in these dominions regarded themselves first and foremost still as British. The situation in South Africa, however, was somewhat different, for there the British migrants had always been, and still are, a minority when compared with the settlers of Dutch origin, let alone with the indigenous black majority. Only after the Boer Wars ended in 1902 could the 4 British self-governing colonies, including the 2 previously Boer republics, negotiate with Britain and achieve, in 1910, dominion status within the British Empire under the British Crown as the Union of South Africa. Thus, by the time the First World War broke out, Britain's colonies of white settlement and its territories in South Africa had become the British dominions of Canada, Australia, New Zealand and South Africa, within the British Empire, responsible for their internal government, but still under the ultimate control of the government in Westminster and owing allegiance to the British Crown. The Dominions contributed massively to the war effort between 1914 and 1918, and interestingly enough, were co-signatories to the Treaty of Versailles, despite the fact they were not independent sovereign nations. In fact, Britain drew on the human and material resources of the whole of its overseas empire in that epic struggle, including, of course, India and most of the rest of the empire, from Anguilla to today's Zimbabwe, which was more or less directly governed from London. The empire was still intact. No territories had been lost since American independence, and the dissolution, forecast in 1866, had yet to happen. So this is a convenient time for us to have a look at the England's Masonic Empire during this time. I turn first to today's Canada, for it was here that the first Grand Lodge was formed in a British colony. As I've already mentioned, by the 1850s, the several British colonies in British North America had won for themselves self-government. Unfortunately for the Freemasons in Canada, there'd been no such advance in Masonic governance. They still paid their dues, fees, and a charity contribution home. Only the 66 English lodges had achieved any degree of self-government, insofar as the UGLE had eventually agreed to cluster them into 3 provincial Grand Lodges, each under a provincial Grand Master appointed by the Grand Master in London, without reference to its members in Canada, and delegated to them certain limited powers of inspection and control which they rarely exercised. The 20 Irish and the 2 Scottish lodges still reported directly to their Grand Lodges in Dublin and Edinburgh respectively. But just across the border, in the United States, there was already a Grand Lodge in each state, subject to no higher Masonic authority and electing its own Grand Master. The English Masonic provinces in British North America agitated for greater control over their internal affairs and for a voice in the selection of their provincial Grand Masters, but their pleas went unanswered. Increasingly dissatisfied with London, the English Provincial Grand Lodge of Canada West sent the UGLE a petition in May 1853 asking that they be allowed to retain all fees and to elect their own provincial Grand Master. Once again, there wasn't even a reply from my predecessor in London, 1853. I did actually take a reply to Canada when they were celebrating their 150th anniversary, but it was a little late. A convention of English, Irish and Scottish Freemasons met in Canada in Hamilton, Ontario, in October 1855 and resolved, quote, that the Grand Lodge of ancient, free and accepted Masons of Canada be and is hereby formed. Colonel Wilson, its first Grand Master, later wrote to the UGLE that their reasons for secession were not just poor communications, but also, quote, the want of harmony in action and working, resulting from the growth in the province of lodges hailing from other Grand Lodges of different countries, he meant Ireland and Scotland, thus perpetuating local and national feelings and prejudices and conflicting interests. So, for the first time in the British Empire, a significant proportion of previously British lodges had democratically decided to break away from their parent Grand Lodges and form an independent Grand Lodge, as independent as those in the United States, long before the territory had achieved political independence. Back in London, the Grand Master of the UGLE, Lord Zetland, frankly told Grand Lodge in April 1856 that he had decided to take no notice of the petition he received, as it was not unanimous and left nothing at all to what he called the Supreme Grand Lodge. He deemed the new Grand Lodge to be rebellious and recusant. His stance, however, was somewhat undermined when the Grand Lodge of Ireland, following a fruitless attempt to coordinate its reaction to events in Canada with the UGLE, recognised it. Faced with the prospect that the remaining English lodges in the province of Canada West would also break away from the UGLE, Zetland eventually wrote to them offering to